That's an excellent question. And I think this comes down to the mainstream narrative about the war. There was this assumption that Amharas actually support Abiy Ahmed, which is completely false. There was very large-scale protests against Abiy in 2021 and 2022, region-wide protests in the Amhara region. And in fact, the Amhara region has emerged as essentially the largest region which has consistently rallied against the prime minister and has called for the removal of the prime minister. And so the war with the TPLF, the northern war in Ethiopia, was one that was very destructive for the country. But Amhara saw themselves as having no other options because the TPLF actually invaded southward and attempted to essentially return to power. And we're talking about Ethiopia. The current issues in Ethiopia are actually the results of over 3 decades of boiling over a foundation of ethnic apartheid. And what's happened now is that we've come to a boiling point where these protests have exploded. And it's not just, as my colleague said, about the special forces, it's about other issues. Protesters are demanding an end to the Amhara genocide. They're demanding support to IDPs. Right now, the Amhara region hosts the largest number of IDPs in the country as a result of displacement from the war in the north, as a result of displacement from conflicts in the south. And so the removal of the Amhara special forces are actually seen as a way of dismantling that defensive structure, subjugating the people. And I think that people are saying that they've had enough of this type of oppression and they want protection for to their people. And really, it's also important to mention that there are disputed territories in the north between the Amhara and Tigray regions, especially these areas known as Wilkait, Tagade, Tadlam, Setitumura, and Raya. And what's very important to note is that when the TPLF, which dominated the Ethiopian government between 1991 and 2018, took power, they actually expanded the borders of the traditional province of Tigray to form an enlarged Tigray regional state, which stole territories from the Amhara. So these ancestral Amhara lands, as a result of the war, their annexation was reversed, and Amharas were able to take back control of these lands. And these were lands where decades of genocide, of ethnic cleansing against the indigenous Amhara inhabitants occurred. So this is also a very large part of the protests, and Amharas are calling for recognition of this reversal and the ability to have their rights, human rights, respected, and the removal of the Amhara forces essentially endangering tens of thousands of people in these regions. And we can look back to, for example, the Mai Kadra massacre. The Mai Kadra massacre, which took place in November 2020 at the beginning of the war, was the largest civilian massacre of the war. And it claimed the lives of over 1,515 ethnic Amhara civilians in this town of Mai Kadra, which is located in the Welkait area. So removal of the Amhara forces from these areas could actually lead to more Mai Kadra scale, large-scale ethnic massacres against the Amhara people. So this is a matter of self-preservation, and it's not a matter of supporting one group or another.
And I want Robel's view into all of this, because it seems like people in Amhara, according to what you're saying, have been marginalized from this peace deal. Now, we saw a peace deal between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, which has brought an interim government. Why exactly do you feel the Amhara has been marginalized from this peace deal talks?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. And I think there's a few dimensions to that. Firstly, Amharas were actually excluded from the process. The Prosperity Party, as I said before, is a party that's dominated by the Oromo ethnic group of Prime Minister Abiy, as well as the same way the National Army is dominated by the Oromo ethnic group. So there was no Amhara representation in that process. It was a process between the Oromo Prosperity Party and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So how can you expect a multipolar war to actually be resolved by only engaging 2 of the stakeholders? So it was exclusionary, and it actually mirrored the same exclusionary process that was undertaken in the 1990s, in which the ethnic federalism system was imposed in Ethiopia, and the constitution was also imposed in a way that promoted these apartheid policies. And so with this peace deal, I think there's that element, and then the other is that before and after the war, there was no peace. During the war, there was no peace. So after the peace deal was signed, the violence, for example, in the Oromia region continued. And as I mentioned before, this involved the actual collaboration between the Oromo Liberation Army, which refers to itself as a rebel group, and the Oromia Region Special Forces under the command of Oromia Regional President Shimellis Abdisa. And so the Oromia Regional Special Forces have actually been implicated with the OLA in massacres against tens of thousands of Amhara civilians throughout the Oromia region. So I would not call this peace. And the problem is that as this has gone on, and now that we're talking about disarmament of special forces, there's actually no indication that the Oromia special forces are being disarmed. And as I mentioned before, the Oromia special forces have also been implicated in attacks, land grabs, ethnic cleansing on all borders of the Oromia region. So we're talking the Benishangul Gumuz region, the Gambela region, the Afar region, the Somali region. And what this causes is that there is not only a peace, but there's actually a trajectory for this country to go into all-out civil war, which would risk destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa, if not the world. And so we're talking again, 120 million people. This is a huge country that we're talking about. And so when there's talk of Amhara Special Forces disarming, but no talk of the Oromia Special Forces disarming, you can see that there's a problem. If the intent to bring peace and to bring stability to the region was at the forefront of the policy, there would have been goodwill in disarming the Oromia Special Forces first, which also happens to be the largest special force in number of personnel. And then in parallel to the north, we have the TPLF, which also has not appeared to disarm, and we're also hearing about reports of appropriation of humanitarian aid and indications of organization even on the western border of Ethiopia and Sudan, where TPLF forces in Sudan are preparing to launch attacks into the western border. Remember, in November 2020, it wasn't just the TPLF that attacked from the north. The Sudanese military also attacked in the west and occupied Amhara territories to the west. So the Amharas, what makes the Amhara genocide unique is that it's a genocide that actually has taken place over a long period of time, but has also involved various armed groups, both state and non-state. So we're talking the Oromo Liberation Army, the Oromia Special Forces, the TPLF, the Sudanese military, and other various groups. And so the situation in Ethiopia is very, very volatile, and the peaceful protests were actually an attempt for consecutive years to bring the plight and the grievances of the Amhara people to the attention of the federal government, but it fell on deaf ears. And so the protesters made their demands very, very clearly. They said they wanted an end to the Amhara genocide, the immediate removal of Abiy Ahmed and his Prosperity Party from power, including the Amhara branch of the Prosperity Party, as well as an end to the ethnic-based demolitions of homes, an end to man-made famine affecting all of the IDPs and war-torn communities in the Amhara region, and so on and so forth. And finally, before I forget, there's also the issue of over 10,000 political prisoners, including journalists, civil society members, academics, students, professors, humanitarians, and just ordinary citizens, which have been rounded up across Addis Ababa, the federal capital, and other places in the country for their Amhara identity and put into large detainment camps. And so journalists such as Maskaram Abara, Abbay Zodu, Aragaw Sisay, Getinet Ashagre, these are all journalists that were operating independent medias, reporting on the plight of the Amhara people, reporting on the genocide. But the federal government, dominated by the Oromo Prosperity Party, has criminalized reporting of the genocide. So not only has there been a lack of accountability for crimes against the Amhara people, but even those who talk about the crimes are penalized. And so under this framework, I can't imagine that there could ever be peace. And for peace to reign in Ethiopia, I think we need to transition into a policy of transitional justice first, and accountability and inclusion of all groups, including the Amhara.
Thank you, Robel.